E allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia? E allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Buon pomeriggio.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And thanks for being so many at this very important conference of the Rimini meeting that is going to be about inequality, the price that we all pay. So we're going to talk about economy and politics. And in order to set the background, I want to say that so the growing inequalities that we see for some observers is undermining the cohesion of our societies. And many economic experts, many economists used to think that inequalities were a one-spot phenomenon, but instead inequalities are growing. And on the other hand, we have an increase in the level of wealth and prosperity, but we have many wage cleavages and salary cleavages between 1% of the population and the poorest half of the world population. This cleavage is growing in large parts of the world and also inside the nations. Between the 90s and the year 2000, almost half of the prosperity generated ended up in the hands of the richest 1%. We have a heritage concentration, so not really wealth creation was even more important. And this wealth is more concentrated than ever. In 2016, 82% of growth and prosperity, so of wealth, went into the hands of 1% of the richest part of the world population. So 70% of it went in the hands of 1% of the world population. So these are major issues. We have to talk about that. And so we're very lucky because we have incredible guests today. We have José Manuel Durão Barroso. Well, it doesn't need any presentation, I think. is a great friend of the meeting, former president of the European Commission, and now president of the International Alliance for Vaccines. And he was designated in 2002, April 6, as Prime Minister of Portugal. And during his presidency, the European Commission took strong positions and bold positions about the shared destiny of Europe. He's also a university professor, and he wanted the EU to evolve towards a federation of national states with an upper level of integration. He also tried to strive for a more effective bank union in order to better tackle the economic crisis facing Europe. Branko Milanović, following us from New York. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Is one of the greatest international experts when it comes to inequalities. So really, he was a really pioneer when it comes to better understanding these macro dynamics. He's a professor at the City University of New York, and he mostly deals with wage inequalities, but not only that, at level of single states and at global level. He wrote several books that have become fundamental works. Global Inequality is a very famous book that offered a map of this evolution of inequalities, both at global and national levels. It was translated in more than 16 countries. And he recently wrote a book that I really like a lot because it deals with the history of economic thinking and economic thinkers and how over the last 2 centuries, from the French physiocrats to the most important neoclassic, including Kuznets, but also questioning other economists like Karl Marx, offering other perspective. He tried to understand their position vis-à-vis inequalities. Were they sort of expecting inequalities to grow so much, and were inequalities a problem or not for them? So he really did a great work because he studied this phenomenon, I mean, also in terms of a global trend. And then it traced back the history of the economic thought in this respect, trying to see, I mean, who were the first who tried to analyze this problem of inequalities. So we are going to talk also about the relationship between economy and politics in this respect. So I thank our reputable guests, and thank you very much for being here at the meeting. And the meeting is a platform looking at the world from my homeland, Romagna. So please, another round of applause. Give it up for our great guests. So let's start with economy, and then we will go to politics. So I would like to start from Branko. So I'd like to start from your latest book. So you try to trace back the history of economic thinking, and in Italy, this is a topic. This is still largely studied in universities. So in Visions of Inequality, your latest book, you somehow undertook an imaginary conversation with some of the most important economists of the of economic thinking. So why did you feel this need? So usually economists work just with data. Data seemed to be just enough, but you felt the need to go back and reinvestigate the most important thinkers. So why? What did you need to know more than data, beyond data? What did you learn? And what should our audience know about what you learned to better understand our surrounding world? This is the first question. Thank you, Branko.
Thank you very much, Samuele, for having me. I regret that I'm actually not able to be in Rimini with you physically. So obviously this is only a second best. We have to be grateful for technology to have this opportunity, but I wish I was there. Let me try to briefly answer your question. First of all, I was always interested in these great thinkers. I'm going to give their names in a minute. And that was also the time when, the time of COVID, actually, when I was rereading them. You know, many of them, including Marx, for example, I've read now for probably 45 or 50 years almost. And so they were all known to me. And as you know, so much has been written about that. So let me start, just give you the 6 names of the people who are in the book. It begins, as you said, from before the French Revolution. It begins with François Quesnay and physiocrats. Then it continues in a rather predictable order with Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, Wilfredo Pareto, and Simon Kuznets. And then the last chapter ends with developments between Kuznets and 1990, where we do not have individuals as towering as in the past, but we, of course, had quite a lot of work on inequality. So they have, of course, will studied enormously. If you take libraries on Marx or on Smith, you would fill homes and homes with books. The question then begins, what did I want to study and what did I want to learn? I decided to try to look from a different angle, to ask a question, basically, to each of them. Broadly speaking, I'm not really asking that question directly like that in the book, but broadly speaking, is the question, how do you see the forces that determine inequality in your time, and how do you see them evolving in the future? I think this evolving part is quite important, because for many of them, for example, for Adam Smith, he does have the dynamic element. Marx obviously does have a dynamic element, which has been discussed a lot, whether in a more advanced capitalism inequality would go down, whether or up, actually, as many people believe, because there would be the decline in real wage, according to one interpretation, the decline in real wage and concentration of capital incomes. And then, of course, likewise for Pareto and for Kuznets and for David Ricardo, who's, of course, the entire work in some sense was dynamic, because he asked the question, what would happen if the corn laws are not abolished in England. So this was the objective. And I must say that actually I did learn quite a lot, and I hope other people will do. In particular, I think from the chapters on Adam Smith, whom I found much more critical of capitalist accumulation and on what Marx later called the primitive accumulation. Smith is really quite, how should I say, quite strongly in disagreement with the way that the original wealth was often made, through colonialism, plunder, cheating, inheritance, in very, very sort of non-economic ways. So that came a little bit, I think, the strength of that came a little bit of a surprise to me, and also I believe that actually he's much more critical about inequality and the way that the wealth is acquired in the wealth of nations than in the theory of moral sentiments. And that was a little bit a different reading from, for example, Amartya Sen's reading, who believes that the theory of moral sentiments is much more leftist. I will not go through all of them. I just would like to say also that for Marx, I think that if you go textually and if you go even in some sense substantively, I do not think that there is any grounds to argue that Marx believed that real wage under advanced capitalism would go down. Actually, if anything, including the examples that he gives, shows that he was very aware that real wage depends on what he calls historical elements, so that it was not only subsistence, but historical element, and that more developed countries do have a higher real wage. And actually, there are examples where he compares, for example, England to Austria, Germany, and Russia, and of course the the richer countries have, England in this particular case, has a higher real wage. There are, of course, many other issues with Marx, like, for example, the tendency of the famous tendency of the profit rate to fall, which might actually lead to an increase or decline in inequality. If the profit rate goes down, then you can actually argue that capitalists become less rich and inequality goes down. But if it does lead to a concentration of incomes, then you can actually think of the top 1%, very similar to what we are actually witnessing today, where you might have greater polarization. Now, let me just complete it by saying what can we basically learn from that? I think that we can learn two things. First, how our sort of impression, how our view about most dramatic cleavages in a given society always depends, obviously, on the conditions of that society. And secondly, how it has evolved and how it can actually highlight what we are now studying. Because it has evolved from the class being the key element that divided people, ownership of the means of production or simply ownership of labor or labor power. And then with Pareto, essentially, we move to individual inequality regardless of the ownership. With Kuznets, we move to the distinctions between people in urban areas and people in rural areas. And then with neoclassical view, we basically forget about all these distinctions and all individuals become sort of interchangeable. And that was, of course, the time when inequality was not studied very much. And finally, we come to the present, where I think capital versus labor inequality is becoming very important again, and new forms, like gender inequality that practically does not really appear in any of the work that I've mentioned before. Then the issue of racial inequality, for example, the cleavages there, also they do appear because many people, including Smith and Marx, discuss colonialism, but they don't really have the salience that we believe they have today. So, I think we can learn quite a lot from rereading actually many of these quite famous authors. So it's not for nothing they have become famous. And it's not only by the numbers. Actually, by the way, they also, Samuele, have quite a lot of numbers themselves. So we can still enjoy numbers and read Marx.
Grazie mille.
Thank you very much, Branko. So, rereading the great masters, you could somehow highlight again the evolution of inequalities using also data that you keep updating. In your opinion, say, which are the institutional or political reforms that may somehow start tackling this issue? Well, we know that's impossible to fix it right away, but we would all like to have a more shared prosperity. So what to do and how to do it?
Well, of course, Samuel, as you know, this is an enormous question. So I would have like 7 minutes to answer it. So but even if you gave me 700 minutes, probably we would still not be able to answer it. So let me first make one, how should I say, precision just to make this point, because sometimes it is not known or forgotten. When we look at inequalities within countries, as you mentioned before, in many of them, particularly the large important countries, like let's suppose the United States or China or the UK until very recently, or South Africa, inequality has gone up. So there is no doubt that over the last 30 years, for example, US inequality has increased significantly. Sweden, for example, is another example that people don't know, but it's a very large increase in inequality in Sweden. But at the global level, inequality has gone down. And that kind of confuses people because they sort of intuitively, they think, well, actually, if inequality went up everywhere, it has to go up in the world too. But I just want to make this very clear. It did go down in the world because relatively poor countries, or actually very poor countries in the past, like China, and then more recently India, and then Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on, had very high growth rates. So if the poorer part of humankind in the last 40 years has actually grown at the rate of 6 or 7 or 8% per annum, and the richer part has grown at 1 or 1.5 or 2%, what has happened is that the global inequality has gone down. So I just wanted to make this clear that we have had a significant decline in global inequality, meaning all the people in the world, and we had at the same time substantial inequalities in very important large countries, including China as well. So this is what I wanted just to make clear. And answering your question, I will be very brief. I think that we know what are the tools to reduce inequality, from education to taxation of inheritance in particular, and to the spreading of ownership. But I would like to divide the approaches into two types. One approach is really relying mostly on taxation. So this is the taxation of inheritance, you mentioned it before, taxation obviously of capital incomes, of high incomes, and so on. The other approach, which is not, the two approaches should not be seen as alternatives, but they should be combined. But nevertheless, analytically, I think that the second approach would be the approach where you would actually have the objective of increasing equality of the ownership of the factors of production. I know this sounds too complicated, but what I mean is the following. Spreading the ownership of capital much more towards the middle class than it is the case now, because we have now the case that in all advanced capitalist economies, about 90% of financial capital is owned by 10% of people. So that would be one thing, and that would, of course, reduce the inequality. And the second thing, of course, is education, which likewise, if it was more widespread, of course, education is more widespread than capital ownership, but if it were more widespread, it would also be a force for the reduction of inequality. So I think analytically, just to end up this, conclude, I think we should think of, on the one hand, forces for the reduction of inequality that would go through the form of redistribution, which is, of course, taxation or subsidies and other things, and the forces whose objective would be to equalize ownership of labor and capital. So to spread much more deeply ownership of capital towards the middle class, and of course to improve particularly education among people who are relatively poor. So these two are, as I said, analytically distinct, but of course when you do the real policy, of course the president will speak, Barroso will definitely speak of that. You obviously cannot divide them in such nice compartments.
Grazie mille per questo.
Thank you very much. So I now shift the focus from the economical point of view to the political point of view, and in particular, the role that Europe has played and can still play in tackling these global topics. So, José, I'd like to know more about your personal experience. We talked about that on the phone already. This is also a great opportunity for the young audience here with us today to better understand what you try to do to, improve, the sharing of destiny in Europe. And also, we know that you consider culture very important in order to lay the foundation of the required mindset to tackle such major topics. So let's start from here. So where do we come from? So we would like to hear that from you. And according to your own experience, what did the European Union do to respond to the inequality emergency? What's the role of the state and of the institutions? So what should have been done better?
For your invitation. I'm sorry, I do not speak Italian. I understand very well, but I cannot speak. But it's a great pleasure for me to be here for the second time. I was here in 2011, and my friend Mauro invited me again. It's a great pleasure to be here in Rimini, in Italy. As you know, the European Union has one of its objectives shared prosperity. The European Union, first goal when it was created as European Community in the 50s, and Italy was a founding member, the main goal was peace, to make war impossible among its members. And we can say that was done. There was never a war between the members of the European Community. I remember well when I had the honor to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 in Oslo on behalf of the European Union. I want to highlight this because the European Union is not just a market. It's a market, certainly, but with social and political goals. And that's why in the treaty, the current Lisbon Treaty, we speak about shared prosperity, but also about social, economic, and territorial cohesion. Yeah. And so this is what we can do at European level. Because we have to make a distinction between the European level and the national level. So about the national level, there are different models in terms of taxation, for instance. If you compare Ireland with Sweden, it's very, very different. So I will say that when it comes to the differences about the level of state intervention, more state or more market, the European Union is somehow agnostic. It leaves that for the member states. But there are some things in common among all the member states of the European Union. It's what we usually call in Europe the social market economy. So yes, we are market economies, but with different levels of welfare state. We are not like the United States of America economic, quite clearly. The United States of America are richer in terms of GDP per capita, but for instance, the child mortality is lower and the life expectancy is higher in most European countries. Greece, after all the problems we had in Greece, in the euro, has a lower child mortality and higher life expectancy in the United States. Because in Europe, we are more committed to social cohesion, even if we have still real problems of inequality and also of issues of the redistribution. So I think it's very important to make that difference about European level and the national level, because sometimes the European Union is accused of things that it cannot solve. During my time in the Commission, we had the terrible sovereign debt crisis and financial crisis. And of course, the European Union as such has to find a balance between the different countries. And I don't need to remind you that, for instance, the way Germany or the Netherlands were looking at that crisis was not the same as, let's say, Greece or Spain or Italy, or my own country, Portugal. So we were always trying to find a balance. Europe today is 27 countries. Free countries, sovereign countries, that share some competences, but they have different views. That's why for us, in the European institutions, namely in the European Commission, we were always trying to converge around ideas that could hopefully have a consensus. That's why I was always speaking about solidarity and responsibility. If I was speaking about responsibility, I will be very much supported by Germany, but not so much by Greece. But if I speak about solidarity, I will be supported by Greece, but not so much from Germany. So Europe is an issue of combination of different cultures, but at the end with some consensus approach. By the way, it was an Italian intellectual who said the language, it was Umberto Eco who said, the language of Europe is translation. But not only translation linguistically, but translation of different attitudes to the economic system and to the political system. So I think that Europe will remain on that path, trying to combine the dynamism of the market economy with some commitment to social redistribution and social welfare. But nowadays, I'm concerned with the fact that Europe is losing in terms of competitiveness. Namely, when we compare with the United States, the growth mindset in the United States is much stronger than in Europe for growth. And even China, with another system, state-controlled system, they are investing much more than we are in some areas that are vital for growth, like technology, some new technologies. So we have to find a balance if you want to have a more fair society in terms of redistribution. We need to generate more growth so that we can share that prosperity.
Grazie mille.
Thank you. So let's try to go back to your experience again. We're talking about the bank union and your vision of Europe as a federation of states. Could you make some specific examples, for instance, of when you had to face strong resistance from some states, and how did you cope with that situation?
Samuele, I can give some examples. One of the most important examples is negotiations of the multi-financial framework, the budget for 7 years for the European Union. There is always that division between the so-called net recipients and net contributors to the budget. And the Commission tried to put the question that we need to those policies, cohesion policy, for all Europe. But in fact, there were very different positions among our member states. And at the end, we could find some compromise, but let me be honest with you, it was below what I was expecting. Yeah. I wanted more solidarity among the member states. But of course, we have to respect the different positions of, at that time, we were 28 countries. The United Kingdom was a member of the European Union. And by the way, the United Kingdom was one of the most difficult partners when it came to European expenditure or investment. But it was not just about the United Kingdom. An example, when there is a crisis in Europe, very often, some national politicians, they put the blame on Europe. I sometimes say it's that they Europeanize the problems and they nationalize the solution. If things go well, it's their merit. If things don't go well, it's the fault of Europe. One example, there was an issue of layoff in France because one big American corporation decided to go out of France. And then the politicians of France were asking us, the European Union, what are you doing? It's up to Europe to solve this problem. But we had no instruments. That's when I said, let's create some fund for adjustment of those workers so that they can find new opportunities. And you remember that, Samuele, because you also work in the Commission, know that. We created the Adjustment Fund for Globalization. But we had not that instrument before. So sometimes the European Union is a kind of the scapegoat of the governments at national level. I have to say this is true. Another case I can tell you, it's even more difficult. There was in the past a program for bank foods, and that was coming from some funds in the budget. Those funds were over, and so my commission decided to use some remaining funds from the agricultural policy to put for that program. C'était in French, it was le programme pour les gens démunis. I don't remember what's the name in English. Yeah. But of course we knew that that was controversial from a legal point of view. To use that money to support those that in fact had not enough to eat. Because there are some areas in Europe where people do not have enough to eat. They need those banks, food banks. We have, even in some of the big cities, people that are in a very low level. What happened was that two governments of Europe, have gone against the European Commission in the European Court of Justice, suing the European Commission, saying that the European Commission had not that authority. And the argument was a subsidiarity argument. So subsidiarity is a concept that in principle I support, but sometimes it can be also used in this way. And I remember the representative of one of those countries, by the one, some way that was from ideological side that I was not expecting him to say that. So, a very high level, he said, each one takes care of its own poor. It's not for Europe to do it. Each one takes care of its own poor. I understand the point in terms of subsidiarity, but in that case, it means that the European Union is perceived by our citizens as the tough master, the one who imposes the rules, but without instruments of solidarity. And that is one of the difficulties we have in Europe, because the European Union is a political project, and we cannot have support for a political project if we only appear with the rules about excessive deficits or rules for more reduction of expenditure. We need also, while keeping the rules, of course, because they are essential for the internal market, but we need also to have instruments at European level for true solidarity. And this was two examples, but I could mention some others, but it will be for another occasion.
Grazie. Tornerò fra un attimo.
I'll get back in a moment to ask you about your view on the geopolitical fragmentation and the challenge of the European Union before the challenges of these new regional powers. But I would like to go back to Branko now. Before, I was struck when you mentioned something about the reforms, and that one of the aspects to be considered to approach the problem of inequality at the roots is what I call the economic democracy. That is, the idea to favor somehow the spread of capital, and so to take on responsibilities and accountability as much as possible, so that there is a bigger share of the population that is able to take on risks and to build something. And you know, Branko, it's really a pity you couldn't make it to the meeting, but you will see it next time. This area is really rich in terms of diversity, biodiversity, and also the economy. There are so many small and medium enterprises, a lot of entrepreneurs. They're all linked to the community. There are also big industries, big companies, and all the spare parts in the metal industry, mechanical industry. Also in the banking sectors, we have cooperative banks that have the strong links with the community. We have the largest cooperative bank in Europe. So we have this big economic biodiversity, which is so visible here, and we're so dear. It's so dear to us. But sometimes we fear that the big powers, the big forces that lead to the results of globalizations and inequality can put this at risk, can question all this kind of life model. There is an example of this that I call the natural oligopolies in e-commerce, in information technology. These become really strong powers, even more powerful than democratic states, able to determine choices in terms of inequalities without a democratic consensus, without a debate, just simply by having a stronger market power. So could you please share with us some thoughts, maybe some initial thoughts from your research? Maybe we should do something about this, starting with enterprises. What would be the kind of entrepreneurship that could guarantee somehow more shared prosperity? Could it be the case that we took the wrong way? We think that the market is a historical social institution and that it needs a real democratic awareness of the rules of the game. Where did you get to on these thoughts? Maybe this is about your next book and you want to share something about it.
I would be thank you very much for the question. I would be brief. Let me just say that first, Samuele, I agree with you and also with President Barroso, obviously, that the market is a social institution. I recently reread, it was just reissued now, Karl Polanyi's famous The Great Transformation. Of course, the main message, if you will, of that book is that markets should be and ought to be embedded in society, so that there is that the market is really a social construct. In other words, it is not a natural phenomenon that we have to take as given. It is something that we socially can fashion in a way that is most conducive to, human happiness, if you will. On the question of oligopolies and monopolies, I think it's really an important issue. And as you know much better than I, the European Commission and more recently the US have taken, of course, steps towards reduction of monopolies that existed with Google and with different providers, platforms, and internet providers, and so on. To some extent, we were, I think, driven in that situation because there was a certain element of natural monopoly, and then because it is a new technology, you cannot regulate it at first because you don't know which way it would go. So I think it is a problem. As you mentioned before, giving the example of Rimini and Italy, I think in general, the ecosystem of small and medium-scale enterprises is quite vivid and quite important, but they are oftentimes under pressure. Just the most obvious example that we all know is the retail trade. And the retail trade, which now it has even moved much more towards virtually, buying things electronically and then being delivered to you. And that has, of course, created essentially large monopolies that are able to do that. The retail trade, I think, eventually will just basically move to the warehouses, and we would not even actually see the goods anymore in stores. So indeed, these are the problems. And finally, let me just go back to what I said before, and actually Samuele had mentioned to some extent, this idea about spreading both ownership through, for example, worker ownership or through trade union funds and so on, is really an idea which is not new. It goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s to some extent. And you can even see it in Margaret Thatcher's, however strange it might seem, but Margaret Thatcher's idea of people's capitalism. She was quite aware that if you want to have sort of a more socially acceptable capitalist society, you have to have many more people with stake in it, including ownership. We know in the UK it really didn't go that well, but the idea is I think the right one. The idea is to spread actually the ownership through worker shares or through advantages that could be given to small-scale investors, and that would protect actually their funds in the case of total wipeout, so that you cannot, if you have a couple of €1,000, you don't end up with zero. You can have insurance for that. So that was, I think, the idea. But I have also to say, just to conclude, I think actually that technological development was very rapid, and to be fair to the regulators too, it was very difficult to regulate not knowing how the technological development would go. And that was still a bit of situation that existed 100 years ago in the 1920s.
Grazie.
Thank you, Branko. We are here with the foundation of Subsidiarity that is going to create a group of people, of experts, a think tank group about this. I think it is a new field, trying to imagine new forms of spreading of shared ownership in the enterprises. And it is something which is quite difficult to start coming up with questions, even more than the answers. But thanks to people with you, we can do this. We had Rajam Goram that had the same idea. You may remember that, to create an infrastructure, rules of the game that would not uniform the economic space entirely, because it is only from bottom-up approaches, from forms of accountability from the bottom, from the enterprises, that it is possible to generate sustainable development. This is an open field. Now let's move to a wider framework, to the future, and the Europe that you, President Barroso, described as important, considering the shared destiny, the shared future, the shared responsibility. This is a developing institution with many challenges too. But just like the market is not a historical form, the context of Europe is not outside history either. It undergoes all the influences of global trends. We now see the impact of this geopolitical fragmentation, of this inability to find a common field on which to solve the fundamental issues of growth and development and the relationship between states and regions. And talking to young people, this is something that sometimes worries us a lot. For example, considering the issue of creating an area for shared prosperity, as if there were a threat due to the inability to create a brotherhood among peoples. I see Europe quite weak in this respect. Please convince me that this is not the case. I would like to know your opinion about this. What could it do? What didn't it do? And what is the ability to answer in this respect?
Europe is lagging behind the United States, China, and even others in terms of growth. We have lost competitiveness in the last years. We have a relatively good social system compared with other parts of the world. But in terms of growth and in terms of competitiveness and also innovation in some technological areas, some of them are very geopolitically linked. We are lagging behind. And the world is becoming tougher day by day. I think some decoupling is already happening, namely between China and the United States. for geopolitical reasons, and I think it's going to get deeper. And so we are seeing now a revision of the supply chains. We are seeing increasingly concerns of economic security over economic efficiency. There is some threat about the markets, including in terms of protectionism, not only coming from China with their state-led economy, but let's be honest, the United States IRA, it's a hugely protectionist program. That's a way of going investments that could come elsewhere going to the United States. And Europe has to adapt to a world that is going to get much tougher, much rough. And Europe is trying to define, of course, the terms of its relative autonomy. Of course, in terms of security, we are with the United States, we are with NATO, but in economic terms, we have a real problem, and that can be aggravated with the new President of the United States in November. So I'm in favor of the Europeans looking without naivety, not being naive about its own interest. And we can only do it collectively. And this is something I've learned from my own experience. When I was representing the European Union in the G8 or G7 or in the G20. As someone has said, all European countries are small. The problem is that some have not yet noticed it. But when we compare even the bigger countries in Europe, even Germany or France, when we compare them with the United States or China, we are very, very small. Only with European dimension we can compete. And we need that scale. That's one of the reasons we are waiting also, expecting the report of Mario Draghi, my good friend Mario, about European competitiveness. I'm sure he's going to insist on that need of scale. We cannot continue with the 27 different markets for services. We need a capital markets union. Many companies in Europe, when they want to grow, they go to the United States. Because, namely the startups, because there is no deep market to finance those companies. We are also getting older in Europe. There is a real issue of demography in Europe. Some people speak about the demographic winter of Europe, and I'm afraid they are right. So the levels of innovation are going down compared with others. If we go not only to China, but if you go to Thailand, if you go to Vietnam, if you look at the young people there, the level of dynamism is much stronger because they are younger on average than we are in Europe. So we need to invest in our competitiveness. I hope the new Commission, that has done a lot of good things, trying to unite Europe during the vaccine, COVID issue, strong response to Russia about their aggression to Ukraine. But I think, frankly, that the issues of the internal market and of competitiveness were left to a second level of priority. We need to invest more in our competitiveness because if we don't do it, we'll not be able to deliver those social goods that are so important for us. Now, it is true that there is an ideological division also in Europe about more market or more state. And if I may be a little bit more, let's say, personal, there are two gods to which I do not pray. I do not pray to the god state. I do not pray to the god market. What is important is the persons. Each person, not an abstract concept of country or abstract concept of market. The topic of this Rimini meeting is se non siamo alla ricerca dell'essenziale, allora cosa cerchiamo? And what is essential? For me, it's people, people, people. But if I may quote Dostoevsky, I know nowadays it's not fashionable to quote Russian authors. But Russia, in spite of this political regime, they have a great civilization and a great culture. And Dostoevsky, in one of his novels called the Karamazov Brothers, he said, my father loved mankind in general, but he hated every person in particular. So we don't need that kind of love for mankind in general. We have to think about each person in concrete, each man, woman, or child. And our policy has to be geared to the concerns of those people, and not to abstract concepts of more market or less market. And we try to find pragmatically the solutions that could enable higher levels of prosperity, that will enable us to have also higher levels of justice.
Certamente, grazie per...
Thank you for this, because between the state and the market there are indeed people, and to quote Aristotle, of course, these are all linked to a sense of path in everybody's life. So I would like to go back to Branko and to push him a bit outside his comfort zone, because I would like to know more about what's coming next. So let's talk about inequality, not just something to be explained or as a starting point, because to govern these global processes, we need living democracies, participating democracies, where citizens can feel that their participation in life can give the opportunity to orient positively the flow of things. But as you well know, Branko, inequality in this sense can undermine a lot trust in democracy, and it may push towards polarization. As a starting point, society is felt as divided between those who have and those who don't have. So in your view, how do you see the relationship between inequality and democracy? Do your studies can give us some answers empirically, and what is your opinion about this topic?
Well, you know that people have actually tried to do a sort of econometric analysis and to find out if there is such a relationship, but it's very, very difficult. You know, the measures of inequality sometimes, like the famous Gini coefficient, they're too rough. They really cannot, how should I say, they cannot really grasp the cleavages and which are politically salient. So we really have to go essentially through studies of political science, anthropology, and so on, much more than simply believing that if we can just throw in the numbers, the answer would become obvious. I do think that, let me just take the case of the United States. I do think that income inequality has led to political and cultural polarization, which in turn has led to the political polarization that we are now in the process of witnessing and as we go towards the November elections. So I think that one can make this causal claim in the United States fairly clearly. When it comes to Europe and individual countries, I think the situation is a little bit different, because the increase of inequality was less. Polarization still exists in a very significant way. Let's take, for example, Germany, where you do have a polarization between the former Eastern Germany and West Germany. You have also the issue of immigration, which I think is very deeply sort of felt in Europe, particularly when you contrast that with the aging of the population. If people, when I was saying sometimes, when people were avatars, so that really did not matter as individuals, then obviously you would actually have the solution for the European aging by simply importing very many thousands or millions of people from the Middle East and Africa who would like to come to Europe. But that does create political issues, as we have seen actually only like a couple of weeks ago in England, for example. And you see that elsewhere. So, you know, there are these cleavages that I think are only imperfectly captured in the numbers that I work with, and then we really have to look much more at the political science there. And then let me try one more point. If you look at the European Union, EU 27, but don't look at countries anymore, just look at individuals, as President Barroso mentioned. Actually, you have had in Europe a decline on inequality between these all individuals, half a billion of them within Europe, because you have had essentially convergence of East European countries towards a sort of similar level with the West, and you had a convergence and a reduction of inequality at the European level, which of course is a significant attainment, and it was certainly one of the original objectives of the European Union or the European Economic Community, is to make standards of living, a way of living, more similar among individuals, not countries only, among individuals in the European Union.
I wanted to ask you, President Barroso, if you have other comments on this.
It's remarkable that Europe has been what the World Bank once has called a great machine for convergence. If you remember when Spain and Portugal, my own country, were before joining the European Union and when they are now, it's a huge difference. And for some reason, the Ukrainians want to come to the European Union. Because when the Berlin Wall fell, when there was the collapse of the Soviet Union, Poland and Ukraine were more or less at the same level of development. Many economists were predicting that Ukraine was going to develop and become richer much quicker than Poland. But of course the opposite happened, because Poland is benefiting from the European Union, the framework and stability. Unfortunately, Ukraine could not benefit from this. So, in fact, as a whole, as Professor Branković said, Europe has been a formidable, a great machine for convergence. But it's true that some areas in some of our countries, including the so-called old member states, have seen new problems of inequality and problems of poverty, like the ones I've mentioned. And this is one of the reasons why we have the rise of populism, including because of the migration factors. I'm very open by nature, but I have to say that I believe that there are some limits to multiculturalism in Europe, as we have seen in other parts of Europe now. So we have to manage that with great wisdom. Look at the Netherlands, one country that has such a great liberal tradition like the Netherlands. Now they are led by a government that is basically xenophobic. So this is the reality. So we have to understand the concerns of people and to not to create anathema against them, but to come with constructive, rational and reasonable solutions. Unfortunately, rationality is in short supply these days.
Benissimo, grazie mille.
Very well, thank you very much. Of course, this conclusion is not a real conclusion, as we open up a path towards other discussions, other talks, and we can do that in the future. And you are more than welcome to come here, Branko, in person in the next editions. And I would like to thank President Barroso as well. We will call you President forever. I worked in the Commission too, so thank you both for your availability. And give me just 1 minute to draw your attention on this point. Each of us can give a fundamental contribution to the meeting to see what is happening here and to participate actively in this human adventure, the quest for essence. So in the meeting area, you can find some stands called Dona Ora with a red heart where you can make a donation. Remember that the meeting is a foundation from the third sector. So if you make a donation, you can also take advantage of fiscal exemptions. I thank you all for your attention. I hope that this was an interesting point for reflection to you all. Have a great day.
La civiltà dell'amore, fratelli e sorelle, costruite senza stancarvi mai questa civiltà. Lavorate per questo, pregate per questo, soffrite per questo.
Si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia? E allora si è voltato improvvisamente alla gente che era lì e ha detto: la gente che cosa dice che io sia? Chi dice che io sia? E voi chi dite che io sia?